Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the NFU's convention workshop entitled The Climate Crisis in Agriculture, the Global View and On-Farm Responses. Great, thank you. Welcome again, everyone. My name is Darren Qualman. I'm Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action with the National Farmers Union, and it's my pleasure to be the MC for the workshop today. I just want to say a little bit about the NFU. The National Farmers Union is a membership-based national organization for the collective voices of Canadian farmers working together to fight for agroecology and food sovereignty. If you are a farmer and not already a member of the NFU, please join. So you can join the NFU by going to nfu.ca or by clicking the link in the chat box of your Zoom window. In addition, many people attending this session are non-farmers, but care deeply about creating a just and sustainable food system. Non-farmers can join the NFU as associate members. Your membership is important to the NFU, and we hope that you'll join. Again, you can join by going to nfu.ca or by clicking the link in the chat box. We'd like to thank our sponsors who made this workshop possible and who have supported and worked with the NFU for many years. Thanks to our many sponsors for sharing our vision and for supporting our work. We'd also like to highlight some of the upcoming workshops in November, culminating in our dynamic national convention, which truly is, if you've ever attended an NFU convention, they truly are democracy in action. So we hope you'll join us for that as well as all these great upcoming workshops. You can see them on the screen now, and you can also see that same list at the nfu.ca website. We're offering live interpretation into French for all our workshops. The list is up there in French now, so please invite your French-speaking colleagues and friends. I'd like to make special mention of our keynote presentation for our convention this year. Seth Klein will be speaking on his new book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for Climate Emergency. Seth is a really great speaker, and the topic is really critical. He's speaking at 3 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday, November 26th. Please correct for your own time zone. So that's 3 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday, November 26th. In addition to the speakers and the sessions and workshops and the keynote address, I'd also like to announce the launch of a new series of in-depth talks that we're calling NF University, and especially the NF University climate classes. These will be monthly sessions that kick off December 10th and run every month through the winter until April. The inaugural NF University climate class on December 10th will feature 2 speakers who will dig deep into issues surrounding emissions trading, carbon markets, and natural climate solutions. We have details of that event on the NFU website, and you'll be receiving notices via social media. So please plan on joining us on December 10th for the inaugural NF University climate class. We'd also like to offer that you can pick up books by any of the speakers or authors in any of our workshops and the keynote presentation at Turning the Tide. Turning the Tide is an independent bookstore in Saskatoon, so if you're in the area, you can pick it up directly, or you can go to their website and order online and have it delivered. You can link to the Turning the Tide website from the nfu.ca website, and there's also going to be a link in the chat box. When this workshop is done, you'll receive an email requesting your feedback. Please take a minute or so to fill in that feedback survey so that we can continue to improve the presentations that we provide to you. The survey link will also be shared in the chat at the bottom of the screen. Before we begin, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that our participants and audience members are joining from across the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. I'd encourage you to go to the chat and list there the Indigenous land that you're joining from. I'm located in the prairies in Treaty 6, which encompasses the traditional territories of numerous First Nations, including the Cree, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Ojibwe, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The NFU recognizes that Canada is a settler colonial country and that Indigenous and non-Indigenous farmers share common ground as people who are on the land and who feed our communities. We recognize that land acknowledgements are only a very small start to discussions and actions, and the NFU is committed to working both through our Indigenous Solidarity Working Group and as a whole to move beyond acknowledgement to action. We invite you to join us in this work in whichever way you can. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers for today. Janet Ranganathan is Vice President for Research, Data and Innovation at World Resources Institute. World Resources Institute is an action-oriented global research organization that works in more than 50 countries. Janet plays a lead role in ensuring that WRI's research and data is robust and actionable across WRI's 7 programs: food, forest, water, climate, energy, oceans, and cities. Janet founded and led the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Initiative, an international multi-stakeholder partnership convened by WRI and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development to develop an international greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standard. I connected with Janet as a result of WRI publishing an excellent report on cutting greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. That report is entitled Creating a Sustainable Food Future, a menu of solutions to sustainably feed more than 9 billion people in 2050. And I also have followed Janet's work on carbon sequestration and other issues. Our second speaker today is Takota Coen. Takota is the co-owner of a 250-acre second-generation organic farm in central Alberta that raises milk-fed pork, grain-fed beef, free-range eggs, forest garden berries, and herbal teas. In addition to farming, he's also an author and an educator who works with other land stewards worldwide to help regenerate the health of their little pieces of the planet. He holds a permaculture design certificate from the Permaculture Research Institute, a holistic management certificate from the Holistic Management International, and a Red Seal Journeyman certificate for carpentry. Takota comes highly recommended from several NFU members, and I was hooked when I watched his online video where he gives a drone tour of his amazing farm. Janet will speak first, followed by Takota. So please go ahead, Janet.
So first of all, thank you very much, Darren. I'm really pleased to be joining this group. And I must admit that I would prefer to be given Takota's talk. I also saw that video of his farm. I'm going to give a talk that's going to a little bit focus more on the sort of global challenges and forces that are actually shaping farms. And I have to admit, it feels a little scary. I've worked on many environmental issues over the years at the World Resources Institute. And I have to say that each issue kept leading me back to the food system, the global food system, whether it was biodiversity, climate change, water, deforestation, poverty, all roads lead back to the food system. So I've got more and more interested in this. I've been convinced that you can't solve the problems with the food system as environmental problems either. They're also fundamentally development problems. Okay, I've got 25 minutes, so let's see how I do here. Got a lot to cover. So just thanking the partners of the work that I'm going to mostly be sharing, which comes from a report that was about 7 years in the making, creating a sustainable food future. And of course, our generous funders behind it. So one of the key things we try to do with this report, and it's online, it's free and open for you to use, is that we said how to sustainably feed the planet in 2050. And we realized it's not very easy. And it's a sort of tale of these 3 gaps. And I'm going to start with the gap that's kind of the focus of today, you know, that the world needs to close a GHG mitigation gap. Are you seeing me in the screen as well? Maybe I should move that over. Is that better? Yeah, okay, yeah. So here's the emissions today from the global economy. This is the world emissions. This portion here is from agriculture, and that's the rest of emissions. So agriculture is about a quarter of global emissions. Here's where they're projected to go under a business as usual, from 12 gigatons to 15 gigatons. And here's where we need to get all emissions from all sectors down to under the Paris Agreement, the 2-degree agreement. So just to sort of show that creates a 11 gigaton emissions gap for the agricultural sector to finish, which is the difference between what projected emissions are going to be in 2050 versus what they need to be to do their proportional share of emissions reductions under the Paris Agreement. And one thing to note, that actually under a business usual scenario for agriculture, with 15 gigatons, and the Paris budget, the global greenhouse gas budget, agriculture could find itself burning through 70% of the economy-wide budget. So agriculture is going to be absolutely pivotal to whether or not we achieve the Paris agreements. And here you can sort of see where the emissions are coming from. So again, this whole thing is the whole sector from the whole economy emissions. And you can see that 14% of the global emissions are from production-related emissions, and another 10% from land use change. So think about agricultural frontier expanding in Congo or Amazon or Southeast Asia, into the forest frontier. The emissions from that loss of forest contributes to about 10%. You might not think about that so much in there. I want to come back to some of these different sources of production-related emissions, but one thing I want you to note is that of the production-related emissions, so 25% of total emissions, 14% from production, more than half the emissions relate to ruminant livestock, so ruminants, goat, beef, and lamb. So more than half of the production-related emissions come from just the livestock, which contribute just a portion of our food. The second big gap that we close, and we can't even think about closing that GHG mitigation gap unless we also close this gap, is that we need to produce 56% more food. So it's not just a distributional issue in 2050. There's actually a gap between the calories produced today and what we'll need to feed just adequately the whole population. So that's a big gap that we have to close while closing that mitigation gap. And if that wasn't challenging enough, there's also a big land gap. And I'm going to talk about land a lot in my presentation. I'm going to keep coming back to land. So over there on the left, you see the total amount of area that's devoted to pasture and cropland globally. So 401 million hectares, 192. The gap and what we need in terms of the agricultural land needed to close that 56% food gap is about 593 million hectares. So 2/3 of it is pasture and 1/3 is croplands. And I also want to say that the world also needs to close a gap in livelihoods of farmers. So farmers are often some of the poorest people in many of the countries that I work. And so we have to close that food gap, land gap, and GHG gap while improving farmer income too, and also farm workers. So why the need for more food and land use? So obviously population growth, that's the growth there between 2008 and 2050. But also not just the number of mouths, but what people are putting in their mouths. So as developing countries become middle income countries and people move from the rural to the urban areas, they tend to meet more land and water and resource intensive foods like meat, milk, and fish. So that's another factor playing. And there's also shifts in where food is being produced to areas that are less productive, and therefore you need more land. So one thing we realize that there is no silver bullet to solving this problem. It's going to take a series of solutions that are both about increasing production, these blue ones here, as well as reducing consumption to close this calorie gap here, which is a 56% calorie gap that I talked about. And I'm going to talk about some of those solutions. Okay, so increasing production, reducing consumption to actually close that gap. Let's see if I can just move this thing out of the way so it's not getting, admit someone. Yeah. So we came up with this 5-course menu of solutions that both simultaneously close the GHG gap, close the land gap, and the food gap. I don't have time to go through all of these today, so I'm going to focus on a few. And let's see if I can get this to come. Getting a bit of frozen here. Okay, I'm going to focus on course 1, which is about reducing growth and demand, and course 2, which is about increasing food production, and the last one, which is about reducing GHGs from agricultural protection. I don't have much time to spend on 3 or 4. I thought those 2 would be most useful today. If you're interested in the others, you can refer to the report. So let's start with course 1, which is reducing growth in demand for food. So we had a number of solutions on this course. And the first one I want to mention is reduce food loss and waste. So about 32% of food globally by weight is lost between field and fork, or about a quarter if you measured it in calories. So 1 in 4 of all calories that is intended for human consumption does not actually make it. And in fact, if food loss and waste were its own country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter behind China and the United States. And I always think of food as not only wasted water, wasted land, wasted greenhouse gas emissions, and wasted money. It's a kind of, you can address this, it's a win-win. So this busy diagram here tells you where food loss and waste is happening between field, which is down this end, and fort, which is about consumption. So here you can see North America. So they're about 42%, almost just under half of all food is wasted there. You see the bulk of it's happening during consumption, the red stuff there, okay? And very little there, a little bit in production. You went right over here to sub-Saharan Africa and you see the opposite, a lot more happening in production, a lot more food loss in production, not very much waste in consumption. So WRI has been working on that. We've developed what's called a food loss and waste accounting and reporting standard. We got what gets measured gets managed. This is something that cities, countries, and companies can do to kind of first assess where they are losing food loss and waste in their supply chain, and then identifying where they want to sort of prioritize improvements. We've also created an initiative called the Champions 12.3 to cut food loss and waste by half by 2030. 12.3 is actually the Sustainable Development Goal that is actually focused on reducing food loss and waste. So a bunch of people there, governors. I mean, the guy who chairs it, Dave Lewis, he happens to be the CEO of the largest food retail company in England, Tesco's. The second strategy I want to talk to you about reducing growth in demand for food is around shifting to healthier and sustainable diets. And by the way, all of these solutions I'm talking about, they don't just close the food gap. They are addressing the GHG gap and the land gap too. So shift to healthier and sustainable diets. So what we're predicting with FAO numbers is about an 88% increase for beef and lamb and 66% increase for meat and dairy. So if you're in that business, you're not going to go out of business with this growing demand. So that growth is happening at a faster pace than just calories generally, which is 56%, as I told you earlier. This is a very interesting diagram here. It's a little busy, but I want to sort of walk you through it, okay? What this is showing is the amount of protein consumed on an average per capita basis for different regions. And this red line here, about 50 grams of protein is what World Health Organization recommends as the average adult dietary requirements. And what it does is this does show is how much of that protein that on average, someone in India gets. So they're getting just over the amount in India. They're one of the lowest here. And this green says how much of that protein is coming from plant-based sources. And up here in the brown is how much is coming from animal-based sources. And the size of the wedge is just proportional to the population. And the really interesting thing here for me was that across the globe, people are consuming more protein than they actually need for their daily requirements, even in places like sub-Saharan Africa. Although I would caution there that sort of those national average numbers actually mask the fact that actually there's a big difference between how much protein people get in rural areas versus urban areas, with rural areas very low and urban areas much higher. So we're consuming a lot of protein. We're consuming more than we need, and not all protein is equal when it comes to the resource intensity of it. So this diagram, I don't know if you can see it here, but on this side, you have plant-based protein sources, wheat, rice, maize, pulses. And over here, you have the animal-based, so fish, eggs, pork, poultry, dairy, and beef. So beef is off the record in terms of both the amount of land you need, pasture, and then crops that are fed to livestock, but also in terms of water, that's the blue one, and in terms of GHG emissions. You might not be able to see the color there, but GHG emissions got agricultural production emissions and the land use change emissions. So the big spike there is coming from the land associated with rearing beef. So I'm just going to run through this quickly, but this, if you think about these two different sticks as the average US and world diet. So here's the average US, this is the average world diet on the left. So first of all, the average world citizen consumes a lot less calories than the average American citizen. This is the amount of the calories they're getting from plant-based sources, the average American. Then you can see we have other animal things like pork and chicken, dairy, and then that little tiny red layer up there is beef. And you can see the United States consuming more plant-based protein, but a lot more proportionate of animal-based meat. Now just keep those two numbers in those two sticks in your mind. I'm going to tell you, what does that translate? What do those average diets translate into to diet-related greenhouse gas emissions? So it's kind of interesting, the plant-based emissions plant-based foods have very little impact on the GHG. Most of the GHG impacts per person is coming from their choice of animal-based meat, with ruminant meat or beef up there being the most significant highest. So there you are, like, about half the United States diet-related emissions per capita comes from just beef, even though it's only a very small amount of their actual overall calorie intake. And there's the land, looking at the average land use associated with that diet, which more or less tracks the GHGs. So one of the scenarios we looked at, is what if we reduce the consumption of ruminant meat? And I want to, for all of you dairy and beef farmers out there, we've never said, no, everyone needs to become a vegan. We just don't think that's realistic or plausible. But we said, what about in these high consuming regions, which is consuming a lot of meat today? What if they reduce this, in part to create planetary space so other countries can consume more? But so if you cut ruminant meat to about reduce it to about 1.5 burgers a week, it actually closes that GHG gap that I talked about earlier and the land gap in half, just reducing the ruminant meat consumption, not turning everyone into a vegan, just reducing how much they consume of that. WRI, we don't look just at problems. We're also trying to drive solutions. We have something called the Better Buying Lab, which is looking at food services retailers, helping them to persuade customers to buy more plant-based diets or plant-forward diets. We have something called the Cool Food Pledge, which actually the city of Toronto recently signed, where they committed to reduce their food service-related emissions by a quarter between 2015 and 2030. And we've got some labels for cool foods. Let's just submit someone in here. I don't know why I have to keep doing that. Someone else could do that for me. The third thing I'm going to mention on the, you stop this thing coming up down all the time.
Jen, I think you've muted yourself.
Yep, there you go. Okay. Avoid competition from bioenergy for food crops and land. So think about the United States, one of the largest corn producers in the world. About more than half of that corn is used for corn ethanol. So that land is not used to produce food, it's used to produce a source of energy. We actually did some analysis. We said, actually, many countries, some in the European Union, have set 20% targets. 20% of the transportation fuel has to come from bioenergy. And so we did the calculations. If you fast forward to 2050 and you project what kind of transportation demand will be, what would 20% look like? How would you meet that from land? And you'd basically have to devote the entire harvest of crops, crop residues, grass, my lawn, everything, wood in 2020, to actually meet that 20% target. I just say that to say that this is not a scalable solution. That's not going to happen. There are many other uses for land. So it's not a good idea. Okay, let's see if we can get this going. Okay. So the next course, and let's just check how I'm doing for time. Yep, is to increase food production without expanding on agricultural land. This is like really one of the most important things that we have to actually do. Just to tell you that that budget here is the budget of the land that we have globally. Just under half of it is used to produce food, of which 2/3 is for pastures and 1/3 for cropland. There isn't a lot of spare land here if we want to keep forests as forests, which we need to under climate scenarios, but also these other areas of land. And it's not just food. And I just recently talked about biofuels that are competing for a finite amount of land. And we're not making land anymore. We've got the population growth. We've got 56% in crop and land. We've got a 68% increase in meat and dairy that requires a lot of land. Beef lamb demand up by 88%. That translates into 200 million hectares of additional cropland, another 400 million hectares of expansion of pasture land. But there's also the wood products demand. They want land too. I mean, I'm hearing initiative after initiative talking about, actually, let's scale up the use of wood in buildings as a climate mitigation strategy. Well, that requires land because we're already using, much of the wood products today without scaling up any further. And then there's the expansion of urban areas. Just talking a little bit about the land gap again. And I want to say that when we made those projections earlier of that land gap of about 600 million hectares, we had already assumed that productivity gains in our baseline. We assumed that productivity gains were going to increase at the same rate as they've done in the last 50 years. So that's already built in, and there's your sort of 500 left. So we don't continue to increase productivity at historical rates, that gap is going to be a whole lot bigger, and the GHG emissions track it as well. And so countries like Canada and the US are very efficient about producing beef production, but they're still going to have to be even more efficient to close some of those gaps. But we have to close the even greater gaps in the rest of the world. Here you can sort of see how greenhouse gas emissions efficiencies in beef production vary by a factor of 30 across the globe, with the blue areas being very low efficient and the dark green areas being very efficient production areas. Same with crops. What this document tells you is that, future yield needs will need to be even higher than in the past to meet the projected demand on existing agricultural land. So the yellow there is the average annual yield growth for different crops from 1961 to 2010. The blue is the average annual yield growth that you needed to avoid further increase of harvested land. And then the red are the FAO projections. And not all, but most of them, we need to significantly increase productivity if we want to close that land gap, meet our GHG target, and still be able to provide the food that we need. I'm going to skip that one. Just sort of go on to production-related agricultural emissions here. So, I think I talked about earlier that, production-related emissions are about 14% of total all sector greenhouse gas emissions. Land use was about another 10%. But here you can kind of see the split. I'm afraid to touch my screen now with the pointer because the thing keeps coming down as I do that. But you can sort of track up where the emissions are coming from. So ruminant is that dark red at the bottom, then ruminant waste, manure management. The blue is on-farm energy, soil fertilization, primarily related to the use of synthetic fertilizers, and then rice up there in green. And you can sort of see how that's increasing. There's a 2010 on the left. There's a 2050 in the baseline, assuming productivity gains on par with what we've had in the past. And there's where production emissions rise if we kind of like just capped no productivity gains and just kept where we are right today. It just becomes unmanageable. Yeah. So here are some of the strategies to reduce emissions from agricultural production. I've already talked about boost productivity, but there are now strategies for reducing emissions from livestock because they're a significant source. There are like kind of food additives that you can do to reduce cow burps. There's a whole slew of strategies around manure management, also waste that are actually deposited on pasture land, and about how we increase the efficiency of the production of crops that are actually fed to animals. Reducing emissions from fertilizers by increasing nitrogen use efficiency. I don't know the numbers for Canada, but in the US, nitrogen use-related emissions were about 50% of the total production emissions, agricultural production emissions in the United States. I don't think they're probably that far off in Canada. And half of that is a big wasting there. Half of that nitrogen's added, never actually makes it to the plant, so it becomes a nutrient problem too. And here, I don't think it's just, the onus should not just be on the onus on farmers to solve that problem. There are things that fertilizer companies can do. They can add these compounds to fertilizers to inhibit the conversion into non-usable forms by plants. That would actually improve your usage, your plant usage of it. So I think, we need to be encouraging our fertilizer companies to do it, much like, the automotive companies they're required to make more fuel efficient cars. So we need the fertilizer companies to make more sort of, efficient fertilizers too. Adopting emissions reducing from rice management varieties, increasing agricultural energy efficiency and shift to non-fossil energy. That's often quite a small part of overall agricultural emissions coming from the use of energy, but I know it's something you've been focused on. And then I put on here, focus on realistic options to sequester carbon in soils. If you actually Google my name and soil carbon, you'll see that WRI has come out with some work that suggests actually the opportunity to sequester carbon in working agricultural soils is unfortunately a lot less than a lot of people think of. That's not to say that it's trying to do, some of the practices that do it aren't good. They're good for other reasons, particularly building resilience to climate change or the impacts of climate change, but they're not so useful for building soil carbon. So you can kind of see how all these things add up, and I haven't shown you them all, but on the left there is the greenhouse gas emissions under business usual. And right there on the right, the little yellow strand is where we need to get emissions to be compliant with the Paris Agreement. And you can see each of the contributions of the 5 different menus I talked about. So reduce growth in demand, plays a really big part in closing that GHG gap. And the little hash thing is where it's coming from land-related emissions. The dark is from production-related emissions. So shifting diets has a massive impact on reducing land-related greenhouse gas emissions, cutting food loss and waste. Then you can go into the increasing food production. We didn't talk about agriculture, and then the production emissions in blue there. And if you go to the 56% food gap, you can see the contributions there. And actually, look right there, productivity plays a major role in closing that food gap, with then other things coming in, like reducing population, phase out of biofuel, use of dedicated land for biofuels. Shifting diets, not so much. That's more on the land and GHG side, and reducing food loss and waste. And then lastly, that's how the strategies contribute to closing the land gap, with shifting diets playing a really significant portion if you're focusing on ruminant meat, because it's so land intensive. So in summary, we've got big demand side challenges. We can't solve food just as an agricultural production issue. We've got to address the demand issue, and we have to do that in a way that's fairly. Like, we're going to reduce meat consumption, to do that in a way that recognizes that some people, some parts of the world, they need to be eating more meat. So we're not going to be producing less meat. We just need to allow some planetary space for some people to eat more while others are eating less. Ruminants, it is not all meat, it's ruminants in particular that we need to address. And we need to be more efficient. I mean, a lot of those solutions about, producing more on the same land. It's about, more per hectare, per animal, per liter of water. And not so much for Canada, but in many parts of the world, in places like Indonesia and Brazil, we need to be incentivizing farmers to produce more, while at the same time, those incentives also incentivize that they protect what's left of the forest. They don't just use their profit from more productivity to further expand into the world's forests. So I can't get this picture up, but I don't know why it's come. Let's go back. I actually had the picture of the report that Darren and others have written, the NFU report on how to do it. And one of the things I heard from that, the picture's gone for some reason on the left, but one of the conclusions was any low emissions food system will be a low input system. And so I kind of agree with that. But from from what I've shared with you today, I also have to say it also has to be, and I've added in bold those words, it also has to be high yield and high net income system too. So I think I should stop there. That's kind of the summary. How do we feed 10 billion people? Closing these three gaps. So back over to you, Darren, and I'm looking forward to hearing Takota's talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. Thank you for sticking to time. That is a fantastic presentation. We've got some questions coming in the chat box. People should continue to do that while Takota is speaking. And at the end, you'll be able to put up your hand and ask questions or ask it in the chat. But we're going to hold the questions till after Takota has spoke. So please go ahead, Takota.
Well, I could ask about 25 minutes worth of questions to Janet, but I'm gonna stick to what I've got to say, and we'll come back to that. Just a quick introduction about myself and where we farm. We've got a mixed 250 acre mixed organic farm here in central Alberta. My parents transitioned to organics in 1988. And since then, we've been, experimenting with, different kinds of regenerative agricultural stuff. However, in 2012, I came back to the farm after I got sick of working in the construction industry because of all the problems that it has in it. And I decided to come back to the family farm, mainly because I came across this word, permaculture. I saw a lot of these problems that Janet was talking about, and got really concerned about them, and realized also, like Janet mentioned, that kind of all these world's problems they all had either were directly or indirectly related to agriculture. And so I figured, well, somebody must have figured out some way of addressing this stuff. I can't be the only person who's seen these problems. And so one day I Googled alternative agricultural practices, and because we had been doing organic agriculture, but we were still seeing drops in yields, we were still seeing a loss in profitability and other problems. So one of the things that these systems that came up under this alternative agriculture, there was things like, biodynamics, holistic management, and one of them was permaculture. And so the definition that really grabbed me was that from one of the founders of this system is permaculture is the conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems, which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. It is the harmonious integration of landscape and people, providing their food, energy, shelter, and other material and non-material needs in a sustainable way. And when I read that, I was like, wow, that's exactly what I want to spend the rest of my life doing. And so what I want to talk to you guys about today is some of the practices that we've been experimenting with on our farm since 2012, and some of the experiences that we've had with those as it relates to this broader conversation of climate resiliency and things like that. So before we jump into talking about some of the things that we've done on our farm, I think it's useful to just understand exactly what agricultural is from like a base principles level. So if you think about it, agriculture is really just the practice of humans managing 4 ingredients, just like a baker in a bakery shop would manage his supply of flour, water, yeast, and salt, and mix those together in a variety of different ways to create a bunch of different products. And so as farmers, we also have ingredients, and those are sunlight, water, soil, and organisms, flora and fauna. And so all these ingredients, just like those ingredients I just mentioned at the bakery, the flour, the water, the salt, and the yeast, they're all essential and they're all interdependent. Meaning if any one of those ingredients is missing, you can't bake anything. Doesn't matter how much flour you have. If you don't have enough yeast, your limiting factor is your yeast. And so they're actually all interdependent in the same way that you can have a whole bunch of all of them, but you can only produce as much crop as you have whatever your limiting factor is. And so I like thinking about it in terms of this really simple base principles like this, because then you can build up from there to understand what I'm going to talk about next, which is a definition of systems. And so this comes from the work from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He's the author of a book called Anti-Fragile, another book called Black Swan, and other things like Skin in the Game. He's a fantastic author. If I can't recommend his stuff highly enough. But he has he differentiates systems, whether it's a financial system or an ecosystem or a business. Or it could be a tool, anything really. He breaks it up into these 3 categories. There's fragile systems, there's resilient systems, and there's anti-fragile systems. So a fragile system is one where if there's any stress or volatility, they're easily harmed by it. A resilient system is something that it's resistant to volatility. It's like a rubber band. If you can stretch it, but it always kind of comes back to its resting place. However, then there's anti-fragile systems, which is for me, when I first heard about this, it was a totally new concept, but it's transformed the way that I think about things on our farm, particularly with respect to those 4 ingredients, which I'll come back to in a second here. Because anti-fragile systems, they actually like volatility. They benefit from it. And so if you were to imagine, the labels on a shipping box, if you're shipping something in the mail and it's fragile, you want to put a sticker on it that says fragile, handle with care. If you're shipping something that's, and that might be like a Fabergé egg or something that's glass or, an electronic that can be damaged. However, if you're shipping something that's resilient, you don't need to put anything on the box because it can't be hurt. If you're shipping something that was anti-fragile, you would want people to shake it. So this is like the legend of Hercules and the Hydra. If you cut off one head, 2 more grow back. They actually benefit from stress. The human body is an anti-fragile system. If you lift weights, you're literally stressing your body and you get stronger from that. This idea of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so ecosystems are anti-fragile. And in particular, I'm now going to go through kind of our farm and how on our farm, we are trying to use permaculture design, this idea of mimicking ecosystems, so that we can build not only resilient systems that are resistant to change, or they're not harmed by it, but systems that actually benefit from it. And so I'm going to go through examples of all those four ingredients: water, sunlight, soil, and organisms, which make up those four ingredients. And if folks are coming from a holistic management background, or if you remember back to your kind of grade 8, science class, this can be seen of as the four ecosystem processes: the water cycle, the solar energy flow, the nutrient cycle, and the successional cycle, which we're going to talk about. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about water here. So this is a photo of my ancestors. This little girl here would be my great-great-great-grandmother. And this photo was taken in 1914, just like a mile away from my house. So this is where we farm now, right next to Red Deer Lake. And dug into the side of a hill was where my ancestors first settled on this land when they came here from Europe. And so what I want to pay close attention to is this little hand dug well up here in the top right hand corner. So and the reason I'm showing this photo is that in the last 100 years since my ancestors got here, or when they first got here, the Red Deer Lake was spring fed. There was water literally popping out of the ground everywhere around this property. That well would have been, maybe a dozen feet deep. It was a hand dug well. Today, fast forward 100 years, and as a result of our activities, agricultural activities, the draining of wetlands, irresponsible land management practices, things like that. Red Deer Lake now, the springs have all dried up. It's no longer a spring-fed lake. The water levels are dropping. Now our wells are hundreds of feet deep as opposed to just dozens of feet deep. The water quality is not very good anymore. And actually on our property, which as I mentioned, we've got a 250-acre piece right next to Red Deer Lake. We've actually already burned through several wells on our property. So, we had a very low producing well in our old farmyard. It was like less than a gallon a minute. So we dug another well. It only produced for a few years, and then it went dry. We dug another well. It was dry right off the bat, and then we finally dug another well closer to the lake, and we got a little bit of water there, but it wasn't great. And we've been kind of slowly, just eking by on that water. So in 2013, a year after I came back to the farm, I started studying permaculture design and was really interested in how ecosystems have the ability to heal themselves. That they're not just resilient, that they kind of maintain a status quo level. No, they can actually repair themselves. They can regenerate themselves. I got really interested in shifting our previous land management from, which was predominantly, we did 2 years of grain in certified organic grain, followed by a 5-year hay rotation. So it's a pretty standard organic crop rotation. And what I wanted to do was to, again, mimic ecosystems. So how do ecosystems manage those four ingredients? What's the most productive, efficient, anti-fragile way that we can mix sunlight, soil, water, and organisms together to produce some kind of a crop, which is the foundation of civilization, which is agriculture. And so the first thing I did was I went out and got topographical maps so I could actually read the shape of the landscape to understand how water flows, to read where microclimates are, to understand the geology. And from there, I started doing design via a program called Google Earth Pro, which is a freely available GIS program that I use on our farm and with my clients and students. And what we did is we basically asked the question, what does our land want to be here? and how can we help it become it? And so our land, we live in the aspen parkland biome. It's characterized by groves of trees interspersed with grasslands. If you walked away for 100 years, that's what the land would become. And so we realized, well, we need to move away from this predominantly annual-based agriculture and move towards more of a perennial-based agricultural system based on what our land is best for. And so we found out where all the old wetlands were, created designs for how we were going to, capture and store our water. We started practicing broad scale water harvesting via tools like swales, dugouts, dams. And over the course of the next few years, we slowly started implementing that design. So you can see some of these curvy lines. These are all on contour. This is one of the first swales we built. This is the second one. You can start to see some of the smaller dams that we built on our property, some of the dugouts. The wetlands have now been fenced off. This is a photo that was taken in 2019. It was early in the spring, so the grass hadn't quite greened up yet, but you can start to see where all the water is starting to pool up. The last swale that we've put in, and some of the trees that we planted along there. And so particularly these swales are very useful for harvesting water, which again is one of the ingredients of agriculture, because they're essentially a wetland on contour. So any water, whether it's rainfall or snowmelt, that's running off the landscape because of a lack of soil carbon, because the land is frozen solid, because of heavy rainfalls, because of erratic climatic patterns, doesn't matter. These swales will harvest all of that. They basically fall into these trenches just like they would in a wetland before they'd all been drained, and they slowly spread out, and they have time to sink into the soil where they can recharge the aquifers and be available to plant roots. This is one of the dams that we built on our property that just last year, that's equipped with a flood irrigation system. So this is the dam here, or the kind of the dugout side. The dam is being built here, and there's a pipe that flows through that. And what that allows us to do, here's the aerial shot of that same dam being built, and that culvert runs to the base of this dam wall, is that after spring melt, which is where we get almost 50% of the water in our climate comes in the form of snow melt. And so we get half of our water comes during a 2-week period, and then that's it. And then we only have rainfall, and we rarely ever have enough rainfall that it can't infiltrate into the soils based on our climatic patterns. So snow melt is a huge strategy for us to harvest. And so this dam that you can see built here, the hole is empty. And fast forward a few weeks, that dam now has almost 2 million gallons of water, which is the equivalent to 4 years worth of water that our farm uses based on for all of our domestic and livestock uses. We use about 250,000 gallons of water a year for everything on the farm, ourselves included. Except now, because of that flood irrigation system, there's a pipe through here. If I want to, I can actually take this water that's above the grade, and I can flood it into this swale that goes for 1 kilometer across our property. And you can see another photo of it here in this, how the swales stretch out across the landscape. And there's a lot of different reasons that we're doing that. But the primary reason is we're trying to get that water recharged below ground where it's not prone to evaporation. In our area in central Alberta, we can lose up to 2 feet of water in a shallow pond from evaporation a year. We only get 12 inches of rain. And so we can lose 2 feet of water just from evaporation. But if it's below the soil and it's protected by the shade of trees or grass, it's a lot more resilient strategy. So this is a photo of one of the swales. Basically, the idea is that we can flood that water out into the swales, and it infiltrates down into the below ground, away from the sun's evaporative force, where it can then be taken up by the roots of plants as they need. And plants actually have the ability to modulate the groundwater table. So just to put this into perspective, in terms of how this is like everything up until now has just been a kind of resilient system, right? It's something that resists stress. However, 3 or 4 years ago, in our county, we had the worst drought in decades, with the worst flooding in decades in the spring runoff, followed by the worst drought in decades, and this within the same year. And this is what farmers, when I talk to farmers all around the world, this is what they're saying: is we're getting the wettest year, the driest year, the coldest year, the windiest year, all in the same year. And so, but with these swales here, you can see how they're slowing and spreading all that snowmelt that caused flooding. Roads washed out in our county. On our farm, we didn't even notice it. No water even left the farm. It all infiltrated into the ground. And then later, during the biggest drought in decades, you can see, here the land, the grass is dead up on this hill where there wasn't any water. Yet down around the swales where that water had recharged below ground, we were able to get a regular crop of hay and several grazings on this lowland that was next to the swales. And so you start to see how this becomes an anti-fragile system, is that when there's a stress of a flood, these, just like the wetlands used to be a buffering force on that, these swales can do the same thing. They take the huge influxes of water and they spread it out and they infiltrate it into the ground. And then when there's a drought, the plant roots just go deeper into the ground to access that water that's already there. And so again, it's an anti-fragile system. It gets better when there's disturbance, when there's stress. So now I want to talk about the another ingredient of agriculture, the flora and the fauna, the organisms, and how we are using different genetics and different permaculture design ideas on our farm to create anti-fragile systems there. So the central idea behind this is that wherever you are on the planet, there is a successional cycle or a group of organisms, plants and animals, that when there's a disturbance in the ecosystem, like a fire, a flood, a glacier, landslide, it wipes everything away. There's a predictable pattern of the flora and fauna that will exist, for the first few years, 10 to 25 years, 25 to 100, 100 to 200 years. It'll start with pioneer organisms, move to climax organisms. And typically, if you have enough rainfall, it goes from grasses to mature forest. So, but this isn't the case for every ecosystem, but every ecosystem follows the same successional pattern that it's predictable. So as I mentioned before, in our area, if there's a disturbance, like say an annual cropland, if you were to walk away and do nothing in our area, in 100 years, you get a forest with grasslands and animals grazing around it. That's just for zero energy whatsoever. So we said, well, why are we fighting that? Why don't we just work with it? Why don't we partner with it? So that's what we did. We took that disturbed ecosystem, and in 1 year, as opposed to 25 years, we planted a perennial forest garden with pastures on either side of it. So we fast-tracked succession, and we replaced some of the native species that weren't as productive, and we replaced them with things that were more productive for humans, but they still provided some of the same ecosystem services. So things like apples, pears, plums, bur oak, black walnut. There's over 9 different kinds of berries that we grew on our farm. And we planted these in a way so that it mimics a natural forest ecosystem. So there's canopy trees, there's mid-story trees, there's understory trees, there's ground cover, there's vines, there's an animal component to it as well. So you've got proper nutrient cycling. There's special kind of dynamic accumulator plants that bring minerals up from below ground and deposit on the surface. And all these different things. There's something that blooms every single day of the year in the system. So we always have pollinators. And and then what we did is as I mentioned, we have, so this is that same forest garden. That photo was taken right from this spot here, looking over at this hill there. And we planted, perennial pastures around that. And we graze livestock in a rotational grazing pattern so that there's a really efficient utilization of grass, but there's also a really good disturbance pattern so that the grasses are breaking down quickly because they're incorporated into the ground. There's also, it's really healthy for the animals because they're not, laying, they're not, eating, sleeping, and defecating on their dinner plate. They're moving every single day of the year, so we don't have parasites any problem, which means we don't have to use any anti-parasiticals or anything like that. But we can also still crop in between those areas if we need to, whether it's hay or grain cropping systems. And we just repeat this pattern across the landscape. So there's a swale here, followed by a forest garden with pasture that animals graze in between, followed by another swale, followed by trees, and then grassland. And there's another one that's actually above this photograph. So these are some of the berries that we produce on the farm. As I mentioned, there's over 9 different kinds of berries. We also raise, I think Darren misspoke, he said grain-fed beef. we produce grass-fed beef, actually. Our cows haven't had grain for over 30 years. And yet we're still getting, Janet was talking about how we need to increase productivity. Our cows are reaching the same market size as grain-fed animals in a fraction of the time with no grain because of the genetics that we're breeding. Same thing with our pigs. We've actually been selective breeding for animals that require low inputs and yet have high outputs. So our pigs, for example, a minimum of 25 to 30% of their diet comes from grass, a minimum. And every year we increase that because we're actually developing genetics and we're saving the best of the best animals and carrying that forward. That's another example of using stress on animals to make them better. That's an anti-fragile system. I'm going to have to skip through some of these last ones here to save time. We're also doing a lot of things with cover cropping and intercrop planting. So we grow barley, peas, wheat, and oats all in the same crop system, along with a dozen other cover crop species. We combine them all together. They're planted at the right mixture for our livestock feed, which we grow on farm, and we're able to grind that and feed it to our livestock and maintain a complete nutrient cycle on the farm. We harvest all of our own hay and feed for our livestock on the farm as well. Yet we're using anywhere from 2 to 4 gallons of diesel per acre, a fraction of the energy inputs of our neighbors, and it's decreasing every year. We're also working with new species of natives, things like duckweed, which has 73 tons dry matter per hectare, which is 3 times the amount of alfalfa crop, but it produces 10 times the amount of protein per soy per acre. And all it requires is shallow water filled with livestock nutrients. So we actually have a corral system that drains livestock effluent into this pond that produces this duckweed that we then feed back to the animals themselves in a closed loop system. We are producing cattails, another native plant that produces over 5,000 pounds of flour per acre. That's almost, in the 1930s, the US government did research on it, comparing it to things like wheat, oats, rice, potato. And this single plant beats them all hands down in terms of yield. It's almost double the amount of yield per acre for wheat, and very similar yields to or nutrient components for protein and carbohydrates and stuff like that. Except we don't harvest it ourselves. We let our pigs go out and dig into it. We're also doing things with fathead minnows and fish and things like that. I'm just going to finish up the last slides here, and we'll just to go through sunlight and soil here, just another 30 seconds. So I'm going to show you some photos of our farm next to a kind of industrial farm on the right side. This photo was taken May 24th. This photo was taken June 17th. This photo was taken August 3rd. The canola here is already bloomed, and it's now going to stop photosynthesizing. This was a different year. This photo was taken August 29th. This was a barley crop. So you can imagine which one of these farms is sequestering more carbon, which one is photosynthesizing longer. If you don't have a green growing plant, you're not capturing sunlight, which means you're not sequestering carbon. In terms of soil health, you can see here down this valley, which this is the same creek that flows through our property that didn't exist before. Once it crosses onto our neighbors, they're cropping right through it, and you can see all the soil erosion that's flooding down that hill. I'm going to end with that, just to keep tight with with our time. Actually, just this one last slide is change is the only constant in the universe. Things are always changing. The important thing is how are we going to respond to that change? Are we going to be fragile? There's some kind of event that's going to happen. Are we going to be fragile? Are we going to be resilient? Or we just bounce back to where we were before? Or are we going to strategically invest in anti-fragile systems that actually benefit from change? They're improved by it. And with that, I will thank you for the opportunity to speak at the conference, and I look forward to the questions.